Oh, fucking hell, got his yards out of the way.
Okay, three,
Ah.
two, what?
I was gonna fucking start on you, son of a bitch.
Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Three, two, one. Episode 10, Lewis.
Yep.
Nice round number, supported by a brand new profile picture as well. I don't know if the rest of the art will be up by this time, but 10 seems like a good milestone.
Yeah, it's all coming together eventually. I swear, eventually we're going to have these episodes up on Spotify. Like it's going to happen really
We're
soon.
close now. Once we get the cover art, actually, we have that just now, so we could get that uploaded, within the next couple
Yeah,
of days.
right. Okay, yeah. It only took us 10 episodes, 10 weeks. Not too
Yeah,
bad.
what do you think you've learned in the last like 10 episodes? What has this experience given you, if anything?
uh, I guess on like a less serious note, I've learned that my body makes a huge number of noises I was never aware of before. It's just slightly upsetting.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, it's been more of a personal learning experience, especially with my friendship with you. I think I've
Mm.
learned that we're not as similar as I once thought we were.
Yes, yeah. That I was just saying to my sister a couple of days ago that it's like, yeah, the one thing I've probably gotten from this is that you and I disagree on a lot of things. It's because I think we just never we had in-depth conversations, but never to the extent that we're having on Guide, right?
But the reason I think it comes across as well, the reason I think we thought we were more similar is because we
Hmm.
have very healthy disagreements. Whereas, when you normally disagree with someone strongly or you think different things from them, it normally results in like an argument or like things can
Mm,
get a bit heated.
right.
If you can't talk about things like respectfully in the proper way. But I think we have like healthy discussions, which makes us think we're more similar than we actually are because we compromise on a lot of things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, Guide has been brilliant so far. As much as it has only been 10 episodes, yeah, I've learned a tremendous amount. Just trying to like articulate myself and trying to understand someone else's perspective as well. So yeah, I'm glad we've done 10 episodes, and I really hope that we can keep this up for as long as we possibly can.
Yeah, I agree. So if you didn't know, this is Guide to the 21st Century, a conversational podcast between two friends, Lewis and I, as we discuss topical issues and try and navigate the minefield that is life in the 21st century.
Each week, Scott and I have been going away and thinking about a topic that's been playing in our mind. We'll go away and disseminate this information, have a little background research, bring it to the show, and we'll try and just reach some new conclusions and hopefully learn about when we're going along the way.
Yeah, so probably more important this week than it has ever been. If there's anything that we say that's wrong in this episode, or if you have another opinion, or you want to leave a comment on any of the discussions we have, please feel free to do so on YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz.
We're
Um,
here to be educated.
yeah, exactly. So when we started this podcast, Lewis, we came to the sort of almost like realization that anything was up for discussion. And that's something that I still like stick by. I kind of firmly stand by that statement, and I want us to be able to talk about anything,
Hmm.
as long as it's done like in a respectful manner. Having said that, I told you what my topic was going to be about yesterday, and you were like, maybe
Bold
that,
move.
yeah. So I think this one might be probably the most topically charged item that we've brought to the table so far, in that I kind of want to talk about the implications of the current conflict that's going on in Israel and Palestine.
Okay.
Um, so over the last week, I know there's been like military strikes between the border between Israel and Palestine, and before this, I was not really aware of anything that's been going on over there. But just before we start, do you know anything about this conflict? Have you got any baseline information?
So the reason that I was shocked that you chosen this for topic was because yeah, I am shockingly unaware of this issue. I know that there are something to do with religion. I know it's a very old one. I know that people to this day die every year because of it, and it's a very, very serious issue. Um, I really hope that I really hope that you were able to teach me a little bit, and we're able to reach some new conclusions here. Because honestly, I'm not super informed. I know that there's um, Israel and there's Palestine, there's Jews and there's Muslims,
I
and
think so.
it's something of a dispute over territory, right?
Yeah, so I did some research, and to be honest, the topic I'm not really sure it's something for us to really go in depth on and say who's right and who's wrong. You know, this has obviously been going on for like
Okay.
this has been going on for like hundreds of years, and we're definitely coming to it from the perspective of like education and
Yeah,
wanting
yeah.
to be educated on this matter. And I don't think that you or I are in the privileged position that we're in are under any sort of, we're not able to really comment on what's going on here or what's right and what's wrong. I think that's probably something we should mention up front.
Yeah. It's worth bearing that we are extremely removed from the situation, and we see it in the news headlines. But you are right. This is something that is devastating for people and a very serious topic. But we are trying to educate ourselves and our viewers by approaching this in the way that we are.
Yeah, so recently on Twitter, I've been seeing a lot of, as we do, as we've discussed about in length, on Twitter, you see a lot of extreme opinions. You see a lot of people that are advocating for Palestine, saying that Israel in the wrong. Then you see a bunch of people that are saying that, Israel are actually in the right, and there's like good people on that side as well. And there's like a back and
Hmm.
forth between two extremes.
Hmm.
So I've been doing a little bit of research onto the history of it first of all, and apparently this goes back, it goes way, way back, like centuries back, and all the way back to where when Napoleon Bonaparte was in charge of France and the British Empire was kind of sort of spreading its roots across the world. It goes back like hundreds and hundreds of years,
Okay.
and from what I can tell, the outside world might have had more influence here than people are aware of, and perhaps like a bit more of the blame as well. Because from what I've read, Napoleon Bonaparte and the sort of British Empire that came after that, they wanted to make a sort of home for Jewish immigrants in Palestine. And
Yeah, for the European Jews, I think.
I think it might have had something to do with the control that one of the Egyptian leaders was having at the time, or something like that. But they wanted to make a sort of home for Jews in Palestine. Um, so Jewish people started to sort of emigrate to Palestine, and their power kind of began to rise with the backing of these foreign powers. And over quite a short period of time, I think the immigration levels went from like relatively small to quite big. There was quite an
Hmm.
influx over a short space of time. Not exactly sure what time period that occurred, but it rose, and there was a certain amount of backlash from the Palestinians as people were sort of like flooding in.
And can you tell me, was this a populated land before these Jewish settlers settled?
So as far as I'm aware, I think it was Palestine before, and then so they tried to sort of get a sort of home place for these Jewish people to go to, and a lot
Hmm.
of them like emigrated. They were very much a minority for like a long, long time, but
Okay.
immigration was going under this like massive influx. Um,
And native Palestinians were Muslim?
I believe so. Although I think it's more to do with just people, the Arab people that
Uh,
lived there
uh,
before. I'm not entirely sure
right.
how much it has to do with religion. I think that obviously is a part of the issue, and it has charged it a little bit.
But when we're
Um,
talking about Palestinians, we're mostly talking about a uh, not a religious group, more like a racial group.
I think so. I'm not
Okay.
entirely sure. I think it may be a two-pronged thing where like the race issue and the religion issue are like two separate heads of this massive beast
Yeah.
that's like going on.
Okay.
So you fast forward a little bit, and eventually to try and resolve the conflict that was going on, eventually it was proposed that it became like a two-state nation, like Israel became one thing and Palestine became another thing.
Yeah.
And it was sort of, I don't know if it was agreed or if it was pushed onto them by foreign powers that there was like a line, that this side would be Israel and this side would be Palestine. Now, I think from the Palestinian point of view, the people that are now Israel, they were getting a much larger proportion of the land than they actually owned before this proposal was put in place. So I think they got approximately half the land of what was the country before,
Hmm.
but they actually only owned about 6% of what the entire country was before that. So the Palestinians kind of thought that the people of Israel were getting more that they were entitled to. So there was kind of pushback on that front, and
Yeah.
then there was sort of pushes from the Israeli side to take this place that they thought they were owed. Once this was agreed, not really
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah. I can actually I this bringing back memories I'm talking about. I believe that this area of land was once owned by the British Empire, and the British Empire realised that this is difficult to take care of, so they handed it over to the EU. It was the EU or the United or the UN. Sorry, it was the UN that proposed a two-state solution, and you're right. They initially divvied up the land, but I think Israel. took more land than the initial proposal suggested.
Yeah, so there's definitely been a breakdown somewhere. Now, I'm not exactly sure where to find out how this happened because I was reading articles earlier on and I looked at, specifically, I was reading an article on an old newspaper called The Independent. So it had like a brief history of the conflict. And then I read that article and I thought, wait a minute, does this newspaper have bias? So I then Googled that and I looked up how the newspaper aligned itself, and apparently it was quite libertarian, and it was left leaning on some issues, but it was pro market. And I was like, how does this affect the sort of the
Right.
story that they've written? I'm not really sure. So I don't really know if there is a way these days to go and get like a sort of totally impartial opinion. I'm not entirely certain. So it's probably difficult for us to say, as people who are just trying to educate themselves and trying to figure out, difficult for us to say where the point a finger and blame.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, since that sort of two-state proposal has been pushed forward, the Palestinians kind of fought against losing that land, and the Jews kind of like fought to get it, which kind of, and this is kind of like blurred the lines of the conflict somewhere or another. Like I say, I'm not entirely sure where the sort of conflict has come from, but it seems both sides seem to be going backwards and forwards.
But it comes down to the fact that both of them believe the land that the other person is currently occupying should be theirs.
Yes, I think that's in essence that's what it is.
Core of it. Mm-hmm.
So now I think there's a lot of conflict going on in Gaza, and there's a lot of conflict going on in some place called the West Bank, I think it's called.
Yes.
So I think the state that the small section of the country that's known as Gaza is now seemed to be sort of operated by, I think the UN, the UK and the US all see this as a terrorist group known as Hamas. So let's say quote unquote terrorist group has kind of risen within the Palestinian ranks. And the recent conflict at the weekend there was supposedly Israel fired missiles into a sort of Hamas militant camp, but they claim that Hamas have been using like civilian areas to sort of almost
hide their operations.
as like a shield, almost, is like if you attack this area you actually attack the civilians. So I think there actually has been like a loss of innocent lives, and I think Israel have actually been attacking this, and they're blaming Hamas for using basically these civilian buildings as a shield, and they say they have proof that Hamas have military operations there.
I think that Hamas have it's proven now that Hamas in the past have used civilian settlements as bases of operations. I think that's
Yeah, I think that was the basis of the missile strikes that went on over the weekend, and I think about 42 people were killed. Not sure how many of those were civilians, not sure how many of them were Hamas military operatives. So basically we have this quote-unquote terrorist group that has rose up within the Palestinian ranks and is trying to sort of take back what they see as theirs, and what at one point was theirs until the sort of Israeli and the Jewish immigrants came in. I think this was their location, and it wasn't until the two-state proposal was put in place that the border started to move, and it was like, we're going to split these two things up. Now, this isn't like the first time this has like happened in history. We think about like Hamas rising up, and the world sees them as like a terrorist organization, or we see some of these countries see them as a terrorist organization. However, we can look at the past and we can see sort of similar things. When I see similar things, I think about the US Revolution, because that was a sort of group of people that kind of took back the land that was theirs because they were being oppressed by someone else. So it was like people of America that were fighting back against the British. When I think about the Scottish Jacobites, that England came up here and took control of Scotland under the flag of the British, and Scotland kind of fought back for their country, if you know what I mean.
It's like libertarian revolutionaries.
Yeah, so it's not the first time things like this have happened, and it almost seems to me like if you look back on history, the people that lose these wars are seen as like the terrorists, if you know what I mean. So the Jacobite uprising was squashed at the Battle of Culloden, and it's almost like you look back and you see them as this small sort of terrorist group that wanted to take back from Britain. It's not really seen as a terrorist group in Scotland, I wouldn't think,
right, exactly.
From our perspective.
You're not surprised by that. But yeah, them being the losers, it's like what would have been if they'd won. Like they were quashed and we stopped chaos that day, But I'm sure from their perspective, they were doing it for completely noble reasons, right?
Exactly. And you see it with the American Revolution. If the American Revolution had been squashed and it had continued to go on the way it was, would history have remembered them as terrorists and not as freedom fighters? I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I think there has to be some proof to that. Because at the end of the day, everyone that feel strongly enough to fight and engage in a form of like warfare against something as scary as a country or like a government, they have to have, for one reason or another, they have to be like extremely staunch believers in their cause. Exactly. And like right, and like the causes that you're talking about, for instance, like Jacobites and Americans. And I suppose in a similar way, Hamas, they're fighting for what they perceive to be a lack of their rights. So they are, as much as they are undoubtedly causing terror by killing people and trying to overthrow people, they are doing it for what at least is perceived to be by them and their people noble reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And looking at the history as well, like I said earlier, it seems like that a lot of the foreign powers that are sort of almost talking about intervening in this now are actually, they were like fueling the fire when this originally started. Like when I was talking about how the British Empire wanted like a home for Jewish immigrants and they kind of sent them there, and then it was proposed it was a two-state nation. And in a way, I can almost see what the Palestinians would have a gripe about. You know, I can see
Yeah.
that if that was what happened, and like I say, I'm no expert on the subject, but if it was people that came to their country and then they were told that we should do this two-state proposal, and it was like, but this is our land, but there's a minority of people here that are getting more than they actually
Mm-hmm.
own at this time. You,
It seems unfair, doesn't it?
you can see it. You know, you can see why there might be a group of people that like think this. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that what I don't know too much about Hamas, so I'm not saying that their actions or what they've done are right. You know, they're seen as a terrorist group, so they must be seen as a terrorist group for a reason. You know,
Exactly. They've done things that are horrible, you know.
yeah, they must have. But you can somehow try to get around to the fact that there might be some sort of, I don't know, moral righteousness in what they are doing, or at least they think so.
Do you not also think that it's, as much as they've been like labeled terrorists and you and I are relatively uninformed about their actions and stuff like that, it's clear that Hamas are like the little guy going against the big guy, and there's
Yeah,
always something in human nature which kind of makes you understand that plight in a way.
maybe. I mean, you think when I spoke about the American Revolution and the Jacobites, I think those were very much the little guy going up against the big guy. So yeah, I think that there must be something there.
Hmm.
But they also, if they're this terrorist organization, is the vast majority of Palestine, does it agree with them? I'm not really sure what the sort of average opinion is.
Mm,
But anyway,
that's
so
a good
it sort of
question.
made me think about how we can sort of see it as like one man's terrorist is like another man's freedom fighter. It kind of gives you that.
Right,
It
sure.
almost lends itself to that saying where you can see where they're coming from, but you can also see how there's like terror in the actions. There's death on both sides. There's this war that's going on. I can't imagine that both sides are totally without blame or without fault here. There must have been some sort of blame to be put on both sides for what's happened over the last 200 years. No matter who started the conflict or who's in the right, there's probably
Nobody's
been
hands are clean,
no,
right?
exactly. That's what I was looking for. Yeah.
Hmm.
So if this group has been labelled as a terrorist organisation, now it seems quite obvious that terrorists break the law, right? That's like something that they do. They kind of rise up against something that's like in place and they break the law to do so.
Hmm. They incite some degree of terror.
Yeah. But if we look into the past, sometimes that's like necessary. When you see it in
Mm.
like America with the American Revolution, it was very much seen as like necessary that the governmental system in place was oppressing the people there, so they rose up to fight against it, and that almost seems like it was a justified cause. And because they won that fight, they're remembered as like the good side in that case. So my question for you is almost: is it ever okay to break the law? And when it is okay, when is it right for you to do so? Because that seems to be what this kind of comes down to. You've got a side here who's fighting for what they think is right, but they're being forced to break the law to do so. So when does it become like justifiable to go and do that?
Hmm. This relate to our discussion last week about this whole concept of citizenry forming a militia, right? It's because
Yeah.
if we're to think about this is the example of the Second Amendment in America. That Second Amendment, part of the reason for putting that law into effect was so that people could form a militia to rise up against the government.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that the actions that that said militia would get up to would be considered illegal.
Yes.
If the point of that militia was to overthrow or hamper, stop in some way the current government, then that has to be illegal. So, I mean, we have proof. Apparently, according to the American legal system itself, there are scenarios in which illegal activities should be warranted, according to that framework, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Second Amendment specifically says that you have the right to own a gun because the government has guns, and it's almost saying you will have the right to take over this government should it fail. You have the right to
Mm.
revolt, and that's like one of the, if it's the Second Amendment, not exactly sure how the amendment works, but I'd imagine it's like one of the first things that they drafted up in the Constitution when they wrote that. So it's like it's quite an important law for them as well. So
I think it makes a lot of sense as well, just logically when you think about it.
yeah, but the Second Amendment is almost saying if there is a break in the law, or if there is not a break in the law, sorry, if there is something tyrannical going on here, if there's oppression
Mhm.
going on here, you almost have the right to break the law to stop it.
Yeah, I guess if the law, if the system that is the law is either corrupted or broken down, then you can't be breaking it by not following it because it is. In this scenario, I guess it's been viewed as broken itself. You can't follow laws that are being upheld by a government that is broken, right? So I don't know if that exactly follows, but I do agree with you. I think there must be a scenario in which breaking the law has to be the right thing to do.
Yeah, and it almost seems to me, if you follow that thought through to conclusion, that the only way that that would happen and people would rise up is if there
Mhm.
was a majority of people that thought something, like an overwhelming majority outside of the confines of like an election. If the people were voting for something, or the vast majority of people thought something,
Mhm.
and that wasn't being done, that's the situation in which the people would like band together and like do something about it.
It would have to be extreme, like quite extreme, in order to get people to band up and to overthrow, or not even overthrow, but to go against a system they have been born and raised believing is absolute, right? So it would have to be something extremely potent. For instance, like people going over to the Americas and thinking it's absolute bullshit that Britain is in charge of this free land. What we should do something about that.
Yeah, it was almost like the American people thought it was an attack on their freedom, which was a massive tenet of their society, and they
Mm.
and they eventually sort of rose up against it. So it seems like breaking the law is kind of justified if the majority of the people that are in that state think they're being treated unfairly. They
Mm.
almost have like the right to rise up. So it becomes a case of how many people think like very, very strongly about this. And when it comes
Mm.
to like Hamas, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's just a small organization. I can't imagine it's like the entirety of Palestine that's backing Hamas, right? They're just in the small area of like Gaza, I think. So it's not the entire country that's thinking that way.
That follows. It's probably a relatively small organization, but I guess we need to think about the fact that if I'm correct, I, in my mind, we basically have like Hamas versus Israel.
Hmm.
Is that right? So,
Well, yeah, I think that's the sort of areas of conflict anyway. Yeah.
so in this like scenario, I don't exactly know the point I'm even going for here, but my point I'm trying to make is that like we're talking about this very much is like David and Goliath, like talking about people agreeing with the cause. We have a group of people that view another state, Israel, as being like oppressors, and they're like extremely militaristic, extremely uh, because of the conflict has existed for so many years now. They're extremely aggressive. So you can definitely understand how, at least I guess I can understand if I was a Palestinian, I was born in Palestine, sorry, that I would have an affinity with the views of Hamas, assuming that the views of Hamas are simply overthrowing an oppressive rule, if that's the case.
Yeah. So how do people like revolt against this kind of thing in this day and age? Because the thing that we're talking about is like organizations that have fought for their state's freedom. We're talking about like hundreds of years in the past, and this
Mm-hmm.
is sort of one that's coming forward to the modern day. So we're seeing like Israel Palestine is happening in like 2021, if you know what I mean. Whereas these other sort of uprisings have happened, hundreds of years ago. How does that even work these days? Because you look at these people are kind of rising up. Can they do this like peacefully? Because when I
Mm.
think about people that are like revolting against the system in this day and age, one of the things that I think of is Black Lives Matter. So you've got this like huge sort of like wave in America right now where they believe, or some people believe, the system is like systemically racist, and they're trying to like revolt against it, and they're sort of protesting, but I'm not exactly sure what they want to be done. They just know that something
Mm.
is wrong,
Right,
and they're,
I
they're, they're,
see where you're going for.
they're sort
Yeah.
of like trying to organize these like peaceful protests, and I'm not really sure that this can be done peacefully. How can you revolt against your government and get them to change something and do it peacefully?
Well, I guess what you're talking about, a solution probably is very unlikely to be forthcoming when the entire conflict is based around fighting. The only way I can imagine there being an actual solution would be through diplomatic meetings and rules and regulations. Like that has happened throughout the years. Like there have been third party leaders that have went to Israel Palestine and met their respective leaders and tried to negotiate, that try to negotiate this like two-state system and how try to make compromises. I think the thing is that up until now, like you said, for hundreds of years, those attempts have consistently failed.
Yeah,
So
what the outside powers seem to be coming in, and they always, from what I can tell, they seem to be on the side of Israel when they have came in. They've came in and they've
really.
when the British have put, they've tried to get a home for Jewish people in Palestine. That seems very much in the favor of the Jewish people. And as an aside, I also read that Donald Trump went and met with the Israeli Prime Minister when he was there and
Mm,
got a sort of friendship going with him.
mm.
And I read that he also like delegated the peace talks to his son or something like that, who was he's like a Jewish man,
Oh,
and he claimed that he was like ready to do it because he'd read about 25 books on the subject and stuff like that, and I was like, absolutely
classic
meant, yeah.
Trump nonsense. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Classic
Well, I
Donald
missed
Trump.
that, man. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we've got these foreign powers that are kind of coming in, and from what I can see over the course of history, they've kind of been on the side of the Israeli people. What kind of control or power do the Palestinian people have over that, especially if we're
Mm,
now talking about like a third party coming in and splitting up the conflict? Because if they feel that what the third party has decided is unfair, I don't understand how there can be any way to peacefully renegotiate that if a third party comes in and says we're going to make this a two-state place,
mm,
and they're
yeah.
like, well, that's not fair.
I suppose looking at this from like a political leader that represents Palestine, it's a very difficult situation to be in, isn't it? It's because they have two parties here, Israel Palestine, and Palestine is obviously much weaker in terms of like finance, in terms of military assets, in terms of population. They are coming from the weaker side, and then when you introduce a third party, we need to be realistic here. Like when fucking Clinton or like Tony Blair went over there to try and negotiate these deals, do you really think they were doing this for the betterment of your average Palestinian life, or were they doing this because of politics and it would make their position stronger? Like we have to assume that in the negotiations that are taking place here, people are trying to do it for the betterment of both parties. When in reality, that's never going to happen. Israel's walking into this trying to get the best deal for Israel. Palestine's trying to get the best deal for Palestine, and any third party negotiator is just trying to keep whoever's strongest happy. And I think, from what I understand, Israel is an extremely powerful country. I think they have lots of money, lots of influence, and lots of a huge military.
So you think the third parties that are coming in, what do you think they have to gain out of this? You're saying they want to be on the side of the country that has power. What do you think they have to gain out of that?
I guess at the end of the day, it's in everyone's benefits to try and find a solution, right? Like anyone that walks into this negotiation wants there to be less people firing missiles at each other. That would be that would be ideal. So one thing, from Israel and Palestine's perspective, it's pretty obvious. They want the land, they feel they're owed, and they want people to stop dying. From the third party negotiators' perspective, I can imagine there being a huge amount of prestige if you could solve the Israel Palestine crisis. If you were the leader, the political leader that solved this issue, you'll be remembered forever. I think there are many people that have had to tried a crack at that for this reason, and it is a geopolitical conflict that the entire world has eyes on. It's very much in people's interest to solve this. It just seems that up until now, both sides have been unwilling to compromise, or I suppose.
Yeah, I don't. When I think about the conflict as a whole and what I've read,
Mm-hmm.
I don't really understand what the Israeli argument is. Like I don't really understand. Like they've come into this country and they seem to have been given a lot of things. So I don't really understand what their progression is. Is it a retaliation from what the Palestinians have, the backlash that they've put into it, or have they been sort of aggressors? Because definitely in the recent weeks, it seems like Israeli have been the aggressors in terms of
Mm.
firing missiles at buildings and destroying sort of Hamas
Well,
militant operations.
in terms of like the aggressor, that the one observation I've made on this issue thus far is that it seems that both sides are in the wrong, undoubtedly. It's like, for instance, I think this might be wrong. Just clarifying that, but I think in the recent conflict that happened, this was sparked by Palestinians. I think they might have attacked first, and they might have fired their own missiles at Israel. Because I think thus far in the bout of conflict, like 6 Israelis have died due to attacks from Hamas. The difficult thing is that like when Israel retaliates, they fucking squash them. You know,
Okay.
like it's like it's like both of them are wrong. It's just that from my perspective, Israel, they've got so much more resources. Like, for instance, they've got the like fucking that what's it called? It's called like the Iron Dome
Oh
defense
yeah,
system.
I hear about this. Yeah, where it
You,
basically
you,
just destroys all the missiles. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like they've got literally this futuristic missiles array to like anti-missile array covering their entire home city type of thing, and and like Hamas are like just rebels scraping this shit together. From what I seem to understand, like they don't have like big government office buildings. They are living in civilian homes to try to do this undercover. So I think that a lot of the negative perception, particularly that Israel gets out of this, is because sure, both sides are in the wrong. It's just that the amount of force brought by Israel is unbelievable. Like
Okay.
hundreds of missiles being fired at these guys, and like Israel's defense for this recent bit of stuff that's been in the news. Israel's defense was that this was a headquarters that was protecting terrorists, and it's their fault because they're putting civilians at risk
Mm.
by. But it's like you fired the missile. You fired on civilians.
Hmm.
You can't say that they were wrong for doing this. You were wrong for killing. You pulled the trigger, right? So it's
Yeah.
there's like this. This is the perspective that I kind of can't help but feel here is that there's fighting done, obviously, and they're all bad. It's because they're trying to kill people. It's just that when you look at like the resources available, you can't help but feel a bit bad for Palestine, right?
So from that, we're assuming that Israel have this overwhelming force. So from what we're saying is we think that Palestine don't have any chance to be able to fight back against them. So whether or not they are freedom fighters or have a just cause, it seems like the idea of them fighting back is kind of almost silly in a way because Israel have so much power in doing so.
Yeah, I don't think their fighting will ever. It's not like Israel's ever going to be. We've had enough. You've pushed us too far. You know that will never happen. They're doing it for like the moral decision they're making here. Right?
Yeah, so we're talking that this has gone on for centuries, and there's no end in sight really from
Mm,
the two countries. They seem to be they're fighting away. People are dying every year. You know, hundreds of people are dying literally every year over this war that's just raging on and on and on. God knows how many lives it's claimed at this point. So we're talking about, obviously the goal is to stop this war, right?
mm.
The goal is to come to some sort of diplomatic solution.
Yeah, presumably everyone wants that.
Yeah. How does that even happen? You know, how does that like we're talking about two countries that can't do that. So they haven't come to a diplomatic solution. They can't maybe they can never do so. We're
Mm,
talking about like a third party intervening at that point. So
mm.
we're talking about a force like the US or the UK or the
The
EU.
UN.
Yeah,
Mm,
someone. We're talking about like sending people over in order to like stop the military action that's going on.
exactly.
Does that involve? That'll have to involve military action in itself, right?
Will it? I don't know. Like what I said earlier, I think that's really the only realistic way of implementing a solution. I think you have to have leaders sign agreements, right? And then you have to have government bodies following out these agreements to try and stop the fighting. And the only way you can do that is through diplomatic meetings and negotiations. Like, but that's kind of what I said. Like, I can only that has to be the way you solve this. It has to be a way that's not through violence, because any victory through violence will be wrong. You know, someone will have been done a horrible fucking injustice or whatever. You know, like basically fighting is not a good solution to this. We need to come up with a compromise, some way. And I suppose going back to what we said at the beginning, most of this issue seems to be land disputes. It's to do with like who should live where and in what settlement, and like there's like arguments like you know like have like you've also seen a map of like the Palestine Israel area, and it's like here's a little patch of Palestine here, here's a little patch of Palestine there. It's like obviously it's like scattered because there are like certain historical sites that belong to this people, or there's just like settlements of people or like cultures that end up grouping in this area. It ends up being really patchy. There has to be some type of compromise in which they can decide to divvy up land that keeps the people living in that land happy and political leaders happy with whatever things keep political leaders happy, like resources and will
Yeah,
of the
I think
people.
that was one of the things that I read. One of the things when it became like a two-state country or a two-state nation or whatever it is,
Hmm.
that there were Palestinian people that were kind of like forced out of their homes because
Yeah, I think
they
that's
like
happened a lot.
they lived in that area, and when it became that land became Israel, they were kind of forced out and over the border, and then the UN kind of jumped back in and they were like, no, they can actually go back to their homes, and then the
Hmm.
Israelis were like, well, now that's our land now, so they can't come back into here. It doesn't. I just don't see how this can be like diplomatically solved, because if you come in and you say these things, do groups like Hamas just keep rising up, or is it? Do you think it's the Palestinian government's responsibility to like squash those, or is it the responsibility of a third party to come in and try and issue a compromise?
I'm not convinced that the Palestinian government disagrees with Hamas.
Right.
I'm not
Okay.
sure I disagree with Hamas. I understand why. Well, as I said from the just to totally clarify, I don't know exactly the mantra of Hamas. When I say I understand where they're coming from, I am coming from the perspective of there's a small group that thinks they're being unjustly oppressed by a larger force, and like you said, with like Israel moving Palestinians at their houses, this is a scenario that feels extremely unfair. You know, like you have Israel forcing people that have lived for centuries in communities out of their homes because they believe the land is theirs, and in that situation, it's very, very difficult for Palestine to fight back, because if they do fight back, Israel will drop 100 missiles on their head. You know, like that's a very unfair situation. You know,
Yeah,
you'd
what
feel
I'm
pretty.
seeing a lot in the media, especially when I'm talking about when I've seen these radical reactions on Twitter, there are a lot of people that are talking about justice for Palestinians. So there,
Hmm.
I think because I follow a couple of like gaming accounts on Twitter, I've seen that the company IGN put up a sort of an article that was in support of Palestine, and they put up a couple of charity links that were
Mm.
um, sort of donate to the cause sort of thing. But it was quickly taken down because IGN, it turns out IGN have like an IGN Israel branch.
What?
And they tweeted out saying that, you know, we can't believe they've done this sort of
Yeah.
thing. And it
Yeah.
was taken down. So there was like a whole thing going on there.
Get on the fucking phone right now. Yeah. You're gonna get talked to.
Yeah, so the backlash seems to be a lot towards like Israel. Have you ever heard
Mm.
anyone talk about arguments for Israel? Have you ever heard
Mm.
anyone talking about why Israel are doing the things they're doing?
Yeah. So, well, I've got, yeah, two things. One thing is that like there obviously must be a quite a fraction of people that agree with Israel and their actions. It's because, like, remember, I assume you'll know because you spent more time in Glasgow than I did. But like, oftentimes, like, you'd see a stall at the top of Buchanan Street, which is like pro-Palestine, and then you'd see a stall at the bottom of Buchanan Street, which is pro-Israel. And
Right.
like, whenever one of them would turn up, the other one would turn up, so that they weren't like, so that like, all the information was being disseminated free, like, openly. So like, if they've got a stall, I'm gonna have a stall type of thing. So like, there are obviously people that believe both sides of the story. And this is what I was wanting to talk to you about earlier. It's because I've had a discussion with a man that was born in Israel, um, about kind of about this topic. He's a really smart guy. He was a scientist. He's a doctor. He worked well, I wouldn't tell you what he works in, but yeah, really smart dude. And it was at work, and I remember when I was like, when they were like preparing me to like talk to the customer, they were like, okay, there are a couple of things you never talk about. You know, you never talk about war, you never talk about religion, never talk about politics, anything else on the table. So okay. Uh, Sitting down at lunch chatting to this guy, and all of a sudden I'm saying to myself, how the fuck did we end up talking about Israel and Palestine? And he's sitting there starting to tell me, and it was really interesting because he was clearly a very smart man, and he was basically, what he made out to me was that the story that the world gets sold on the of what Palestine actually gets up to is very different from the actual coverage that you see in Israel. Like, he made out as to me, this was like you know, like 2 years ago or something like that. So I'm just paraphrasing, but he basically made it out to me as if like the actions of Palestine were much more heinous than people are aware of, and people basically they get caught up on this concept of David versus Goliath. They like see the small party and they see the big party and they automatically think that's unfair in the small party. But the reality is here that this is a horrific war, and people have done truly horrific crimes on both parties. And his perception basically was that, like, you know, we are getting rid of the terrorists because they are the terrorists, and he truly believed that, and he believed that basically I was missold the story, and obviously I wasn't going to start fucking. I was just, the whole time I was just fascinating. That's very interesting. Try to move the conversation away. Then I come back to it, you know, and I'm like, so yeah, that was a funny one, but that was really fascinating. It's because I think there must be some degree of truth there. I think I can understand. It's because it's like I said earlier. We see like actions of both groups, and we see the amount of force that Israel reciprocates with, and you think to yourself like that's wrong. You know, like this feels so unfair. But I have no doubt that someone living in Israel that had lost their cousin because of a Hamas bomb would not be feeling so uh, sympathetic to a little guy. You know,
So
this is.
when he was talking about Palestine, was he talking about Hamas or was he talking about Palestine as a sort of unit, as a country?
I think he was more talking about people that fought for. It wasn't specifically Hamas. It was just more talking about the people that fight the conflict that represent. So I suppose that wouldn't have been to do with like a religious group. It would have just been like like a racial group. He likes people that identify as Palestinians.
No, issues like this just give me like much more appreciation for like the systemic issues that are going on around the world as well.
Hmm.
You know, when I do a bit of the research and I learned that it turns out that the British and the French
Mm.
almost like
They
started,
basically caused this.
almost like, yeah, sparked the fire that started the first resistance or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
that sparked the fire of the first rebellion.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it kind of makes me think more about like last week when we were talking about how the Second Amendment is like this really systemic thing in America's, and the sort of how the country's been founded and
Mm-hmm.
it's lasted all this time, and how that makes me think about how there might be racism there and how that's systemic as well, and they struggle to like get away from these things.
There must be dehumanization, right? Mm-hmm.
It makes me think about this war as well, because these countries have come in, they've sort of systemically imposed things on the country. They've said that, these Jewish people are going to be here now, you need to make a home for them. And they're now there, and now they're given all this land, and the people there are like, well, hold on a minute, this is our land. It's like this has been instilled by like a third party, and now third parties are trying to like solve it. And the people there surely, everyone there must just feel totally fucked over, right?
Yeah, I remember. Uh, it was probably just some like comments on like Reddit or something like that, but it was like some post about the conflict happening in Gaza, and it was basically a bunch of people saying like, well, if there's ever a conflict, you know who to blame, the British. The one way at one point in history they've probably done something which directly or indirectly caused this, and it seems to me that that's not inaccurate.
Yeah.
Like,
All three of the revolutions that we spoke about during
yeah,
this have been
right,
openly
yeah.
caused by the British, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and that's yeah, it's shit. It's because like especially for like well, it's not even just I was going to say especially for the Palestinians, but it's really not because we're talking about two groups of people here that believe that their land and their homes and their heritage are being unfairly kept from them,
Hmm.
and like so Israel. I don't know exactly how I don't know the history of it exactly, but like I guess from Palestine's perspective, they've never felt like they've had their own home. It's because like ever since the first like immigration of Jews moved there, it's like they've just had their home taken. And Israel, I actually probably can't comment on their perspective because I don't actually understand the issue enough.
Well, it's almost
But
like they've been given a sort of home there by the forces that have given them it, and then the UN have come in and said, "Oh, we're now going to do this two-state thing," and Israel are like, "Okay, yeah, brilliant, we'll do that," because they're getting like a
mm,
lot out of it, and then Palestine have obviously gone back on that, so they feel like they've been slighted as well.
right, okay, it is probably one of those scenarios where both groups feel that they have been wronged, and like especially because, from my understanding, isn't like isn't like that area of the world like Gaza and West Bank or whatever you called it, isn't that like hold lots of cultural significance? Isn't that why the fighting's so intense? Because like
I think
in
so, yeah.
history and especially in religion, these are like really historic sacred secular sites we're talking about here, and I can understand if like if we're talking about a similar situation here and a bunch of like a foreign country moved into Scotland. Imagine fucking Iceland invaded and like they just started choosing bits and bits of Scotland. Like, oh, we're going to take Edinburgh Castle. That type of thing.
Hmm.
You understand how really upsetting that would be. And I think this whole issue kind of boils down to both sides not realizing that they're dealing with human beings here. Like both people feel slighted, both people feel that the situation is wrong as is, and presumably both are trying to find a solution. It's just that we're now at the stage where I think I guess they just see each other just as enemies to be eliminated, as opposed to go for a more diplomatic solution, just because it just up until now has not worked.
Yeah, the solution doesn't. It quite obviously is by no means obvious, and the radical people that I've been seeing online talking about it have been sort of vastly in the camp of Palestine and saying that these people have been slighted, and
Mm.
trying to back them up and saying that Israel are the bad guys here. But I can't imagine that these people are like super well educated on the issue, and they're sort of. It just comes to back to the same thing again, where you just see like the radical extreme people talking about it on Twitter. But I'm thinking now, the only solution to this problem, and it's been going on for centuries and centuries now, The only solution I can really see to this problem, and this might be really tough for people to do, is just to somehow try and put the past in the past.
Mm,
And, you know, like you say, sit down and think about the fact that these are like human beings they're dealing with. You know, Israel are like firing missiles into civilized areas,
hundreds of missiles. Yeah.
and they come out with a statement like, well, Hamas use them as shields, so it's not our fault they're dead. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like,
Right.
and I can imagine it's the same thing for the Israelis. Like, this guy from your work is saying that there's terrorist movements that happen in Israel all the time. And I imagine there's probably things like that as well. Maybe there's things that don't get reported because
I'm sure
the media is like quite biased towards it,
bias
or at
one
least
way or another.
it seems like it to me anyway.
Hmm.
It seems like the only way to move forward with this is to sit down and say, look, the past is the past. We can't control the actions of our ancestors, no matter how wrong they were. We need to now decide what's good for the people in this day and age. And that can almost sort of be extended to like the topic we had last week about gun control in America, where it's like, yes, maybe 240 years ago, the Second Amendment was a reasonable thing for us to implement. But in today's day and age, it really doesn't matter if you have a gun or not, because if the government wants to take over, they'll do it.
Mm.
And like your gun won't be able to save you, sort of thing. It's almost like these ideals of like centuries and centuries ago. It almost comes back to pride or
Mm.
some sort of, I don't know, something inside you that's saying that you should like have something from like a long, long time ago. You know, these values that are like really, really old now that don't really apply to this day and age. Does that make any sense?
I do. I think I know what you're coming from, but I think that the place I disagree with you is that the reason that it would be so hard for these two sides to talk about this and realize that this is like a legacy they're talking about here. It's not just like we need to think about the modern day people that are suffering. The problem is that it's not all in the past. Like we're seeing horrific acts from both sides being done today. And it would be extremely hard for a government to make compromises with another body that your citizenship thinks are like the bad guys, because
Yeah,
that's it's going to have to happen. They have to make compromises. No one, you will never. There is no solution in which both sides will walk away happy. It's because both of them want everything, but most countries in the world seem to agree that they want a two-state solution. And if that is the case, you're going to have massive compromises, and you're going to need to have compromises with people that you hate, and that's really tough, man. Like,
I get it. I get what you're saying when you say that things are happening like today and they're happening yesterday and they're happening like last week. And I can see how I don't understand. I don't like not obviously I can't fully appreciate it, but I can see how that would be a point of extreme difficulty for people that, especially people that live there now and they're experiencing it. But that almost makes me feel like it reinforces what I'm saying. Where like when we talk about when they sit down to decide what's going to happen moving forward, they almost can't think about what's happened yesterday,
mm,
because if they start doing that, they're never going to move forward. Like they can't start saying, "Well, you did this last week and we did this last week," because that's the same thing. You know, the things that happened hundreds of years ago and the things that happened last week, they're the same. They're all wrong. You know that people are dying. You know,
yeah,
whether one side is justified in what it's doing or not, innocent people seem to be dying here. So you can obviously see that the things that are happening are wrong.
mm,
At the end of the day, if innocent people are dying, what's happening is wrong. Like
y-
there's nothing that'll convince me otherwise there. So I think you have to look back on these things, even the things that happened at the weekend, and be like, right, how can we move forward and stop that? And how do we do it now? Because people that are living today will be dead next week if we don't.
yeah. You're right. That it is like when you look at this logically, that is the way you have to approach this issue. I think at the end of the day, people die right now on both sides. People are having to. It's horrible in these places, and like, there's so many refugees, and it's horrible. At the end of the day, we're talking about divvying up resources and locations and sites, and we're talking about rehoming people, and this is all tough and horrible and really hard and just fucking shit. And I cannot imagine dealing with any of that. But you are right. At the end of the day, the current state of affairs is death and terrorism and war. There has to be something better than that, even if it makes people upset. Because in 50 years, most of those people that were initially upset, they're going to be moved on with their life, and they will get used to whatever
Mm.
system is established, and there won't be fighting, and there won't be this war. But it's hard to think about that in so far in advance. But I don't know. Apparently, I know that Clinton, he was the one person that I know that did go to negotiate this, and he, more than others, came close to negotiating a solution with both sides, and it did involve compromises. It didn't happen, it didn't fall through, but maybe, man, maybe there is a possibility of navigating through this.
There's been a lot of like coverage about it in the last week anyway, so I'm kind of hopeful that maybe that'll get accelerated a little bit. Um, yeah, you're right what you said earlier, and I hadn't thought about this before, where it's been dehumanized a little bit as well. When you just see the numbers, you just see the death toll. You don't think about any of these things, and I bet you if you said to someone, someone in Palestine or someone in Israel, if you said, look, this conflict has to end, or if you said to someone from Palestine, people from Israel are going to die next week if we don't end this, they probably just be like, oh, well,
Good riddance, yeah.
yeah, they're the bad guys in this scenario. And you said the same thing to the Israelis, that Palestinians are going to die. They'd be like, yep, exactly the same thing. There's a dehumanizing element to war in general, I feel like, where people sort of lose they lose the idea of people being like alive and people having their lives, and all of a sudden it becomes a bit like numbers and like what should
Mm.
be yours and what should be theirs. It almost seems like they've lost sight of that, where it's like right now we're talking about where we draw lines on a map, and because we're talking about that, real life people who have lives, who people who have no interest in the conflict, who just want to live at home with their family, they can't do that because we're
Mm.
having this, like, I don't want to say silly dispute, but in the scope of the thing, in the scope of what I've just spoke about lives being lost, any dispute seems silly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. It's a horrific reality, and it's one of those things that throughout history, humans consistently do that. Because, like, think of the amount of countries that have expanded through war and domination and conquering. It's horrific beyond reason. Like, I don't understand how people, when they hear that like two people died in a bombing or something like that, how can you not imagine, what if that was my mother? What if that was my daughter or my son? Or like, how can you not extrapolate the fact that other people are dying and then say, what if that had affected me personally? No, actually, no. I'm saying that. I'm saying that for like coming from like a high horse position. I really, really do understand why people don't do that. It's just human beings are not programmed to think that way. But it's one of those ones that people have to think about it. It's because it's just so. I find it's just so horrifying and upsetting, but it's fucking human nature. At the same time, it's like really, really, really unfortunate.
Yeah, it's almost like I'm sitting here just now thinking, we're better than this now. We're
Mm,
better. Like, the human race should be better than just like killing now, right? It should be above and beyond this. We should be able to talk about anything and not have to resort to violence or fighting or war or anything
mm,
like that. There should be like a diplomatic solution that we can come to and people just agree with it. But sadly, it doesn't seem to work out like that.
mm. It really is a testament for how the like tenacity of human spirit, actually. And I think because when you think about the lengths that people are able to go to fight what they believe is right, it's quite when we're talking about like vigilante terrorism groups like Hamas and stuff like that. It really does put into perspective how what must be going on inside these people's heads, and how strongly they must feel in order to actually go against a country and go into a war where like civilians die and missiles are being thrown around and bombs are going off. Like, it's absolutely incredible the lengths that people are able to go to.
Yeah, to either put your life on the line for a cause that you believe in, or to be able to pull a trigger
Mm,
to end someone else's life, or to end, especially to end a civilian life. That one seems like beyond belief to me. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of stuff going around right now where it does seem like a one-sided conflict, and I just find it hard to believe that something that's going on for so many centuries and has so much back and forth as all these countries that are talking about it one way or the other. I find it hard to believe that just one side
No. Yeah.
is in the right and the other side is in the wrong. It's difficult for me to see that, but that's all you seem to see in the media right now. That's what we're seeing. And I can understand why the media are saying that Palestine have rights and they want to help them and stuff like that. But not every person in Israel is like a bad person. Maybe there's a few people that are advancing on both sides that are doing bad things, but you're right. There has to be some sort of like diplomatic solution, and I just hope that it comes, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, yeah, and to be honest with you, I kind of do have hope. With like technology progressing the way it is and communication, these are the type of technologies that help diplomacy and understanding to that level. Like, I don't know, like it's an extremely long issue that's been going on for so long, but you have to have faith that this can be resolved. There's like, I'm not cynical enough to believe there's an issue so contentious people will fight till the end of time over it. Eventually it'll come to a head. And I just hope that when it does come to a head, people remember that these are humans on both sides fighting this issue, that both believe that they have been wronged and both believe they deserve more than what they currently have. And whatever solution comes as the result of it, that needs to be bared in mind.
Yeah.
Not sure
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope it happens soon anyway.